Welcome back if you've been with us this morning, or welcome if you've just joined us this afternoon. And special welcome to you, Rev Trey Hall, who is the Director of Evangelism and Growth, part of the Connexional team. And momentarily, Trey, I'll hand over to you, and we are in your hands for this afternoon's session, largely as you discuss the God for All strategy with us. I did have to put my hand up for, I was born, Trey, in England, and I was brought up in England, but Slaney is an Irish surname. There's a Slane Castle and a Slane River just north of Dublin. That's mine. And my mother's maiden name was Heggie, which is an Inverness surname, a good Scottish surname. So the closest claim I can have is that Celtic blood runs through these veins.
All right, there you go.
Yeah, watch out for that. So, Trey, we welcome you, and we're really looking forward to your time with us. We're all yours.
Great. Let's pray, shall we? God, thank you for this beautiful day. Thank you for your breath in our lungs, your grace in our veins. May this hour be one of good conferencing. May it be a time where we remember who we are and what we're for. So bless this time, and more important, bless the ministry that's happening across this nation, across these nations, by Methodists, by folks of other traditions and other faiths. Thank you for your faithfulness to us. Amen.
Amen.
So it's really lovely to be with you. It's my first time to the Scotland District Synod. So it's lovely to be with you. I just want to say thank you for your ministry and mission in general. Thank you for being faithful folks, lay folks, ordained folks. And especially want to thank you for your ministry and mission in this time, which is, we've been talking about, I know Mark was sharing this morning a COVID reflection, but just to say thank you for your faith to cling to the one who is the rock in the storm, your willingness to be honest about lament and mourning and sadness and suffering, and also to lift up this time as a time of potential breakthrough for us as a church, where we have a chance to think again in ways we never would have predicted about what we're for. So just thank you. You are our ministers, and I mean that in the broadest sense. You are our ministers in Scotland, so thank you, lay and ordained. Over the next 90 minutes, 85 minutes, I think we're finishing at 3:30. Is that right, Mark? 2:30? I'll share a little bit about the Connexional strategy for evangelism and growth, and I'll share some information, some next steps, programs, that kind of stuff that you might take individually or as circuits or as churches. But I really want to use this time really as a kind of interactive time. We've all been in lots of Zooms of late, and I hope it'll be fun. Hope it'll be hopeful and helpful. But I really do think of it as mostly kind of conversational. So I'll have some input. I've got some games for us to play. We'll be using the chat function, so get that ready. I'm going to invite you to speak aloud and unmute yourself from time to time. We'll break into some small groups at some point along the way. I hope it won't feel like a presentation keynote. That's not what it's designed to do, but a time just to sort of to explore together. I think I sent to Helen and Mark a list of links, web links, and I think those are either been sent to you already or will be sent afterwards. So I'll refer to some things throughout the presentation, but those direct links should be with you soon if they're not already with you. There'll be a Q&A time at the very end, though there's some breakout kind of conversations throughout, and questions are appropriate throughout. So let's it's already circulated. Wonderful. Just want to say, and for those of you who heard me speak before, you may have heard me say this, but I care about evangelism for lots and lots of reasons. Because I've been part of congregations where new people are coming to be disciples of Jesus Christ for the first time, seeing people who have been Christians for their entire lives, kind of experiencing a new dimension of discipleship when they started to be committed to evangelism. I believe in it for all those reasons and many more, but maybe most foundationally, I believe in evangelism. I'm grateful to be committed to evangelism because I am a Christian, because someone evangelized me. I come from a family that's not religious, not really even spiritual. And I won't go through my spiritual autobiography here, but to keep it short, when I went to uni, someone knocked on my door the first week of uni and invited me to a Christian community on campus. And when I got to the place where he invited me, I met a community of people who continued to evangelize me. And when I say the word of evangelize, I know that can be a tricky word for some, even for me sometimes. The word evangelism can be a tricky word sometimes, but when I say they evangelize me, I don't mean they said, hello, here are all our truth claims, which you need to assent to in the next 2 hours in order for you to be part of our club, or here's the way we do things, hope that's okay. When I say they evangelize me, what I mean is they shared life with me. They shared their stories. They asked about my story. We became friends. And over the course of a year or two, in the nexus of those relationships and at this Christian community where I was exploring and reading the Bible for the first time, but also just coming to know who I was, I became a committed disciple of Jesus Christ. And that set of experiences changed almost everything, not everything about me, but changed so much about my kind of perspective, my identity, my vocation. So I say that at the outset. If I seem kind of passionate about this, it's not only that I'm a yappy American from the South who's like exuberant, it's because my life has been changed, saved in the broadest sense and in the theological sense by someone and by a community that was committed to evangelism. Sometimes when we think about evangelizing or evangelism, we think about that stereotype of folks on the street corner, yelling at us, shaming people with bad news, not good news. And I tell the story of when I was living in Birmingham, walking through the high street there. And there's a place in the Birmingham High Street where the evangelists hang out, not just the Christian evangelists, but there's the Muslim evangelists as well, sometimes some Hare Krishna folk. And on this particular day, I was walking by, it's right by the Waterstones, if you know the Birmingham High Street. And this Christian evangelist was yelling at a megaphone and sort of said to me, "Do you know where you're going when you die?" This was his introduction to the gospel. And I said, I'm a follower of Jesus. I trust Jesus. So, I have a sense that, I'm taken care of. He's like, "No, but do you really know where you're going when you die? Are you absolutely sure?" I said, "I've been justified. I've been sanctified. I'm in the process of salvation. I trust Jesus. He said he's going to go and prepare a place and come back and take us to that place. So I'm all right." He's like, "But do you actually know where you're going when you die?" And I said, "Brother, I love your passion for evangelism, but I'm an evangelist too. And I have to say, I wonder if a better question, at least at the beginning, might be, what's your name? What's your story? Here's my name. Here's my story." And I actually think that is the place where a healthy, inclusive, rooted evangelism starts. It starts by knowing ourselves deeply, knowing God in ourselves, wanting to know other people and God and other people themselves deeply, and to build relationships. That's where the magic is. That's where the gospel gold is in real relationships. Evangelism is not about sort of, making tick marks in a sort of ledger. It's about investing in people, letting people invest in us, and discovering God between us. So just want to say that at the outset. And I wanted to give you a chance, if you were the person walking through the door for the first time, to share a little bit about your story. So I'm going to share screen here. Let's see if this works. Here's the question. In the chat, so I want to invite you to share something over the past few years that you have felt really passionate about, something you've been really, really interested in, something that's sort of taken up residence in your whole being. Now, this may be something that falls into a religious framework or a church framework. That's fine if it does, but I don't want you to feel like you have to answer that way because that's the right answer. Like, I'm not looking for, I'm really passionate about organizing the Rota. If that's really your passion, that's great. But what's something that, but better put, what's something that keeps you up at night dreaming? What's something that you kind of give your time to because you are absolutely in a different space when you're about that thing or that commitment? So I'm going to invite you just to pop that into the chat. Decluttering houses. Hilda, come over to my house. Barbara, I could use you. It's such a simple question, isn't it? Like to ask people to tell us what they care about, what they give a darn about, what makes them come alive. It's also quite a gift to share what makes us come alive as well. I think sometimes we think about evangelism as a one-way kind of transaction, like it's something I do to you. But evangelism is, again, about relationships. So as much as it's about offering something to someone else, it's also about being willing to receive something from someone else. Sometimes at church, and I know things have radically shifted over the past 6 months, so this may be less of a thing, but sometimes when I would visit churches on a Sunday morning, particularly to preach, you get the sense, and this is not to shame anybody, I mean, I've done this too, you get the sense sometimes at the coffee hour afterwards or the sharing before, that people really stay kind of at quite a surface level. I should say, you know, we don't dive into the depths of like what we care about, what do we lament, what are we mourning, and like I said, maybe over this past 6 months we've had a shift to be able to do some of that more vulnerably. But that is where that's part of what we're called to, is to share stories, to listen for stories. You may have heard me in a training, if you've ever been in a training with me on evangelism. I'm one of these folks that pre-COVID I'm pretty fundamentalist in a really inclusive way about, like, I think most churches would benefit like actually knocking doors in their community and saying hello to people and saying, hi, nice to meet you. Well, we're the church, you know. I know that's extremely suspicious behavior in some ways. That's not the workshop we're in, but some of the churches in Birmingham that I would say, you know, you should go do this, they were like, we're not going to do that. But one church that I know in Birmingham decided that they couldn't knock doors and invite people to church. That just didn't feel like in a comfort zone for them, which is fair. They were being honest. But they decided they could knock doors and ask people their stories. They could knock doors and ask people what they cared about, what they were nervous about, what they were afraid of, what they were hoping for in their community. And they committed to do that as a kind of discipleship practice. And that church over time kind of grew, it did grow numerically, it did welcome new people into the building, into faith, but they also just became known in the community as a church who cared. So again, sometimes it's about the simplest things, like just asking the question, what do you care about? What are you for? What are you worried about? And then building ministry kind of from that knowledge. Lots of questions about how do we do anything. We learned how to do mission and ministry pre-COVID, obviously. We don't know how, it's hard to shift that into kind of Zoom reality. But I coach a church in the States that in COVID, they sort of did a similar thing. Instead of, they don't knock doors because it's not safe, but they slipped little cards through the doors, not just saying, do you need help? Here's the church's number. That's a fine thing to do. They ask a series of questions, and they invited questions like, what are you afraid of? What have you learned about yourself in lockdown? What do you worry most about? Where was the most hope for you? And they've engaged people kind of online and through Facebook. So they're building community by asking questions about story. I'm going to share screen again really quick, and we're going to play a little game here in a second. Let's see, that's not the one. So, to talk a little bit about the connectional strategy.
Service evangelism. Which one do I? Oh no.
So just talk a little bit about the connectional strategy for evangelism. You know that our calling as the Methodist Church is to, anyone know the calling? Could you say the calling of the Methodist Church if you had to sort of say it from memory?
To respond to the gospel of God's love in Christ.
All right, that's good. That's great. And the last clause is, and to live out its discipleship and worship and mission. I think the first phrase is much stronger. To respond to the gospel of God's love in Christ. And we do that in kind of 4 different ways, right? Here are the 4 different ways that we do that: worship, learning and caring, service, and evangelism. Right there. Nothing new. This has been part of our denomination since 1999, I think. So I'm going to invite you to do an exercise which I saw someone else lead a couple of years ago, and I've been doing it kind of with groups ever since. So I'm going to invite you to think about your church, your local church. Not you individually necessarily, but your local church. And I'm going to invite you, just on a piece of paper or in your head, don't put it in the chat yet, to sort of think about your local church. And if it had to sort of list in order of highest to lowest priority of these things, these important things: worship, learning and caring, service, evangelism, what would be the order for your church? So what, and you might get, what do you give the most time to? What do you give the most energy to? What do you spend the most time in meetings about? Those might be some questions to help you kind of prioritize. So just think through that. Get that order in your mind. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, just for the sake of sort of a little diagnostic experiment, is to sort of, I'm going to call out number 1, and then I'm going to invite everyone to put into chat what they think their church's number 1 priority is. And then I'll go number 2, right? And then you'll type that in, just to sort of see kind of where we are. No shame. It's just about where we are. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? I think pretty straightforward. So I'm going to invite you now to make sure when you're responding, by the way, when you're chatting, you want to make sure in the chat you have typing to everyone. So you don't want to send it. So if you go slide to the top of the menu in chat, you say send chat to, and it'll say everyone in meeting. So click on that. And then if you could put in right now, what is the number 1 priority you think for your church of those 4? So pop those in. All right, now I'm going to invite you to, if you haven't entered it yet, that's great. Just take a moment. And now we're going to do, let's do, what's your second one? Just pop it in real quick. Number 2 in your church. Wonderful. It's good to see. It's sort of interesting to see, you know. It's just obviously anecdotal. This would never qualify as a proper study in an academic institution of any sort, but just sort of a quick investigation. Let's just skip to the last. What's number 4 in your local church? Peter. Maybe number 99, Joseph Lambert says, right? Okay. Here's the news. You are like every other district in the Methodist Church, right? Evangelism always comes in number 4. And this is not about, again, this is not about shaming anybody or saying, the church has adopted a new strategy for evangelism and growth. And the hope is that evangelism, which is not any more important, you could say, than any of those other things. It's not more important than worship or more important than learning and caring or more important than serving, but that evangelism over time would become something that was much more of just a norm of local churches. Not that it becomes the most important thing and we don't do anything else, but that evangelism becomes just part of the way we are, part of our general commitment, like that in 10 years, if we ask that question, that evangelism might be kind of a smattering, might be in place number 1 for some churches, number 2, and not always be last place. And if that's to happen, then let me tell you, as you know already, that's not just that we pass a new strategy for evangelism and growth, we write some beautiful papers about it. Some people are excited about it, that we have to listen to them bang on about it for a year or so, and then they finally go away. If evangelism, if we're going to sort of move evangelism into as a norm for us as Methodist-shaped Christians, then we have some attention to give to it. And this is not going to be a quick fix, but the idea is, the hope is that the conference has said, yes, we have a new connectional strategy for evangelism and growth. The hope is that over the next several years, we start to move into what I think needs to be a cultural shift, where evangelism becomes as important as those other things, where evangelism is not just the calling of a few of us, but it's the calling of all of us. And I think if you know anything about shifting culture or changing culture, you know that that's something that happens step by step, slowly, incremental shifts. And so there's no kind of romantic, to my mind, I mean, this would be wonderful if it happened. There's no romantic thing that like tomorrow we ask that question of every district and everybody says is number 1. This is a slow process of being attentive and trusting God to move us into a place that might feel uncomfortable to us. I want to sort of share with you this strategy from conference, just really quickly, and share with you the kind of component parts of it, and just say a little bit about that. And we're going to play another game and then break out into some small groups. So I'm going to share my screen here again. Oop. There we are. So here are the kind of 8 commitments that we think will be crucial for moving into some cultural shifts and cultural change over the next 5 years, 10 years as a Methodist church. And these are, you can read these in deep depth. I'm not going to go into all the kind of intricacies of them because you can read that if you want. It's in the conference papers. But just want to, just in a few minutes, just go through these 8 kind of areas. The first one is centered in God. I hope that goes without saying, but it doesn't go without saying that our mission is only possible as we respond to the gospel of God's love in Jesus Christ, right? We flow from God's grace. If we do anything good, it comes from God's grace working in us, moving in us. And so that first strategy is around discipleship, is around prayer and spirituality. It's around accountability to the whole life of our response to to the gospel of God's love in Jesus Christ. So that's the foundation, that we are centered in God. If we are not centered in God, if we are not people of deep prayer, if we are not people who are attentive to God's movement in the world, probably our evangelism, our focus on evangelism, as well as the other dimensions of our mission, will be, super thin. They might work based on our personalities for a little while, but eventually they will fail if they're not rooted in and centered in God. If they're not centered in God, if we are not centered in God, then what do we have to offer anyone, really? So the first thing is centered in God. Second piece is around evangelism training, and it stems from this idea that we are all called to be evangelists. That doesn't mean that we are all have that as a spiritual gifting, or we all have that as a sort of capital E evangelistic calling, but that we are all called by virtue of our baptism, by virtue of being followers of Jesus. We are all called to say something about the gospel, to listen for the gospel, to live out the gospel. We're all called to that in different ways, in different accents. Transformational leadership. This is about getting unstuck and getting freed for spending our energy, time, and focus for the right things. Not just the church, but lots of organizations. We find ourselves sometimes entrenched, caught, or stuck. And so transformational leadership is about how we invest in individuals, but really communities of leaders, both lay and ordained, to help local churches and circuits sort of get unstuck and to lead into change. I think COVID has brought us into asking these questions in a kind of much more forthright way than we might have been doing 6 months ago, but that's a key piece of it. The two middle pieces, New Places for New People and Church of the Margins, are absolute drivers of this commitment to evangelism. And by New Places for New People, we mean starting hundreds and hundreds of Christian communities that have a particular focus on reaching out to being in relationship with people who are currently unaffiliated. Unaffiliated, sort of a boring word to refer to anyone who doesn't have a commitment to faith or faith community. And so a New Places for New People is sort of a wide spectrum. It might include a fresh expression. It might include a pioneer project, a church plant, a missional community. It's basically any kind of focused Christian community that has as its goal being in a relationship with unaffiliated folks. And Church at the Margins is sort of a dimension of New Places for New People, which is saying that we have a bias in starting these New Places for New People. We're starting them in communities experiencing marginalization, and starting them led by folks in those communities who are experiencing a marginalization. So not just shipping folks in, but actually building new Christian communities from the ground up. Every Church, a Growing Church, is about every church being committed to making new disciples of Jesus Christ. That involves spiritual growth, that involves missional growth, that involves generational growth, that involves numerical growth. I think sometimes when we talk about growth, we automatically shunt to like, why are we asking for numbers to grow? But I think it's important to put that into a much more holistic kind of understanding of growth. If we are growing spiritually, if we're growing missionally, often, not always, we will be growing numerically. And I'm someone who believes, maybe because, not only because of this, but certainly because I'm one of those who was added to the number of those being saved, to use the language from Acts. I mean, when I joined the church, when I became a disciple of Jesus Christ and was brought into faith, my Christian community wasn't like, oh, we'll add that number to the report. And they weren't excited about that. They were excited that I had said yes and was going to continue to say yes. And we want all our churches to be especially open to that kind of growth. And then the last two around doing evangelism, letting young people, encouraging and deploying young people to lead. And then all of this now, which is this strategy was written before COVID, but digital evangelism being a huge part of our kind of exploration. So those are the kind of core pieces of the strategy. I'll say a little bit at the very end of the presentation today, very end of our time, on some things that if you're ready to move into those, what you might do, what's available. But I want to play another game. And I know some of you have played this game before, but I don't think most of you have, because I've not been to the Scotland District before. So I'm gonna just really quickly actually stop the share. So that's what the church has now. It's not just a draft strategy. It's the strategy. That's what the Methodist Church has said is our church-wide commitment. And I think a danger would be, as I said earlier, that just sits in our CPD, that sits in our kind of cabinet of things we have said are important over the past, hundreds of years. It's there, but nothing really happens. If we are to move evangelism to be a norm, then it will require kind of all of us taking some steps, some risks, moving perhaps in some places that feel really uncomfortable to us, or maybe feel a great comfort. But I think part of the movement involves, like one of my spiritual directors when I was younger said, you can only start where you actually are. You can only start from where you actually are. You can't start from an envisioned self 10 years from now. You can only start from where you are right now. And so as we are all called to take some steps in evangelism, I want to play this little game which helps us think about where we are right now. So you thought about your local churches a minute or two ago. Now I want you to think about yourself. And if we were all in the same room together right now, we play this game in a different way. I'm going to try to describe it to you, and then we're going to play it online. I know at least Jill and Helen and Mark have played this game, maybe a couple of others. But I want you to imagine, we're in the room, a spectrum, a line, a queue across one side of the room. Okay, so you can see it there. And imagine this a spectrum or continuum. And on one end of the spectrum, one pole on the continuum is the I am an evangelist pole. I am an evangelist. I love evangelism. I'm called to evangelism. It's my number one. All day long, I am listening for God's news, living out God's good news, and speaking God's good news, inviting people to explore Jesus and become followers of Jesus. Down here at the other end is the I am not an evangelist pole. You're here if you're like, I have suspicions about this, I'm nervous about this, I don't like this, I am not an evangelist. So I am an evangelist, I'm not an evangelist. So if we're in the room together, I'd invite you to line up, to place your actual body somewhere on that spectrum. It is a spectrum. It's not a false binary. So it's not a 100% or 100%. You might be somewhere in between. But I'm going to invite you to think now, where might you be on that spectrum? Okay? And because we're on Zoom, we have to play it a little less sophisticatedly. So I'm gonna in a second, I'm gonna invite you to raise your hands if you want, about, are you in the third of the spectrum? We're gonna sort of three options. The third of the spectrum that's closest to the third of the spectrum that's closest to the I am an evangelist. Are you in the third of the spectrum that's closest to I am not an evangelist? Or are you in the third of the spectrum that's in between I'm an evangelist and not an evangelist? So which third are you in? A couple of rules for the game. One, it's a game. Again, not a scientific study. It's just a way to get us thinking and talking. Two, it's a no shame game. So really, we are where we are. We are all, I believe that we are all trying to be as faithful as possible. I don't think someone down here is more faithful necessarily than someone down here, right? So just know that. I invite you to put yourself where you actually are, not where you think you should be, or not where you want to be, but where are you actually? And one final instruction is, if you don't like the word evangelism, I would invite you to translate that for yourself in order to play the game. So don't get hung up on the word itself. Think more about the substance of the word. Any questions before we play? So what we're going to do now is I'm going to invite you to either use your hands like this, or you can use your if you want to go down to reactions, which is on the bottom panel, and you can use your thumbs up or hand. So I'm going to invite, first of all, I'm going to invite those of you who are in the third of the I'm an evangelist, third, then not an evangelist, and then the middle. So if you are somewhere in the third closest to I'm an evangelist, stick your hand up. Keep them up, keep them up. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. If you are somewhere in the I am not an evangelist third, stick your hands up. Thank you. Keep them up, keep them up, keep them up. Good, good, good. Wonderful. Okay, hands down. And then if you are somewhere in that middle third, stick your hands up. The people called Methodists. Here we are in the middle. Wonderful, wonderful. All right. Next part of the game is, if because of your life and ministry, you have moved this way. If you have moved over the course of your life and ministry towards the I am an evangelist pole, you may still be way over here, but you've moved. If you've moved this way in your life, raise your hand. If you've moved towards the I am an evangelist, okay, wonderful. Hands down. If you have moved the other way, if you've moved towards, because of your life and ministry, if you've moved towards I am not an evangelist, raise your hand. Lovely. And if you have stayed, hands down, if you have stayed in exactly the same place throughout your whole life, you are one of those extremely stable people, totally rooted, raise your hand. If you stayed about the same place. Okay. What I'm going to do now, and this might be a little messy, but that's okay. We can be a little messy. You can use the chat, or you can actually unmute yourself and talk. And so it might be a little messy if you unmute yourself, but we're going to do that. I'm going to invite you, for those of you who have found yourself moving this way over the course of your life and ministry towards the I am an evangelist spectrum, what have been the factors, or what has caused you or influenced you in that movement? What have been the factors in that movement towards I am an evangelist? So you can pop that in the chat, or you can sort of maybe raise your hand and say you want to speak. Anybody who wants to say something about why you've moved that way? I think I can't see everyone at once, so you may just need to sort of unmute yourself and say, I moved this way because. Come on, Scotland. Let's hear some. Who wants to share?
I think Anne Baird has her hand up, Trey.
Oh, great. Go for it.
Well, I think that I used to find it very, very difficult to share my faith, my belief. It became easier after I started to preach, and that was trained as a local preacher. Not immediately, but having to think about things, work things out, and speak them out loud really did help me. And for 10 years, I was a street pastor. I stopped about a year ago. And that gave me an opportunity to engage with people, not immediately about faith, but about them. And then other conversations flowed. And I found I was becoming much more comfortable about talking with people about what I believed, what they believed, exchanging views. And it was a bit like flowers in the garden, or weeds in the garden maybe, but it just kept growing. And I think I'm in a very different place now than I was.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Anne. Some wonderful shares in the group chat too about more comfortable who you are, more confidence, hanging out with folks who aren't in the church. Anybody else want to say something into the Zoom room about what's helped you move that way? Trying to teach your children the Christian way of life? I see Keith, yeah. Keith, iPad?
I'm one of those people that was in the middle, but that doesn't mean that I've stayed the same. I've probably traveled a whole third, if you think about it. I started off as an evangelist, but not over the top, because I felt there were some people maybe who by their evangelism were putting people off Christianity. So I guess I was in the middle in that sense, but over the years, I've realized more and more that if we stay silent, then people misunderstand us. If we stay silent and not outgoing, then the world doesn't get changed. So the need for evangelism, sharing good news, seeing the world and its troubles and needs from a Christian perspective, evangelism is more necessary now than it even was, I believe.
Thank you, Keith. I see Philip on the same screen. You want to share, Philip?
Yeah, for the last 6 years, I've been working with the CAP, Christians Against Poverty, and job clubs. And it's just working with people that haven't got a job and feel really low. You start talking to them about it and they ask why we help them. They think we get paid to do what, and when they say the reason why we care for people and we're interested in them, and we want to share the love that we have for them, and Christ's love, and that really kind of helps their understanding that there is a world that cares, and the church cares, and the community, and what's going on within the community as well.
Thank you. I want to just get to hear some, just playing, but for folks who have moved the other way, have moved towards the I'm not an evangelist. You've moved that way because of your life and ministry. If you would like to sort of share in the chat, what have been the factors, influences that have moved you that way? And maybe there's one or two people who'd like to share kind of honestly about that testimony. Anybody want to share? I'm looking for hands. I can't see all the screens at once, so. Not Mark?
I'm happy to say that I think I've moved in that direction, although I still put myself in the top, in that third, not top, sorry, in my third that was in that direction. I'm trying to remember what's that direction on every screen. And I think I remember coming to faith when I was 15 at a youth camp and being extremely, therefore, passionate and keen post it, for everybody to hear the good news and respond to it. And I want to say just a number of things have happened in my life and ministry that have shaped that passion so that I wouldn't place it at the end of a spectrum anymore, if that's a helpful way of describing it. So I'm more interested now in questions than I am in answers. For me, that is in response to being a disciple of Jesus who asks more questions than answers. So it's a number of things that feel like they've shifted me from where I was.
I see becoming, from Andrew, becoming more sure of less and less. So when there's an uncertainty, maybe that makes you feel less able. I see, is it Connie has raised a hand, is that right?
There's Jenny raised a hand.
Jenny, sorry, yeah.
No, it's fine. I think also there's something about, I'll call it time of life and your position in life, and the places you find yourself and the people, your ability to meet with people so that your role vis-a-vis others changes. Some people will know that a group that we have been involved with in our local church has just, for understandable and proper reasons, closed down. And that, I know, for me, takes away an area of contact with other people. Where conversations, it was people with learning difficulties, might arise, and you could have conversations. That has necessarily closed, and sometimes as you get older and health and so on, so that, and COVID itself, so that it's something that I think too about opportunity, or the fact that you might be able to offer more support to other people, prayer support or life experience support. So in a way, it's indirect. So I think circumstances come into it too.
Thank you, Jenny. I see Peter, and then I'm going to move us along. But what would you like to share, Peter?
Yeah, well, following on from what has just been said, certainly before COVID, preaching twice most Sundays to small rural churches, where we might say the congregations are already preaching to the converted, with no new people coming along in the villages. I don't know. I mean, we're encouraging, which is slightly different to evangelism, but we are still encouraging. I hope I'm still in the middle group, obviously. Yeah, as some of us get older in life, and the congregations get older, it is more difficult. Whereas if I was out on a youth mission, it'd be something totally different.
Thank you. So we could do this game all day, and I think it's a really wonderful game exercise to do with your local churches to explore this. I mean, because as I said earlier, you can only start from where you are, and so as we're surfacing these kind of questions, this is the material that we work with, right? So it's not that we surface all this stuff and then say, okay, good, we've dealt with it, now get out there and start knocking doors, right? All of this stuff is kind of worked into our response to be hopefully a more outward focused church that is committed to evangelism, and that's going to look different for different places. Some of the constant things I hear about in playing this game over and over again, factors that have moved people this way towards the I am an evangelist have been a realization that God was calling them to practice evangelism, not with a personality or theology transplant, but by being who they actually are. And so there's a lot of fear, like if I'm going to be committed to evangelism, I've got to adopt a theology that's not mine, or I've got to somehow get a personality that's not mine. And when people start to discover the joy of, like, we share good news from our own perspective, with our own accent, from our own experience, then that is a huge kind of encouraging factor that enables people to sort of take a risk. And that perspective might be one of more questions than answers, loving the stories more than telling the stories, you know? So that's one thing, is just realizing that it's not, I don't want to say it's individualistic, but our perspective, our particularity matters in how we are committed to evangelism. And the other major factor that moves people along in terms of feeling committed to evangelism is just trying it and having a positive experience. And trying it often with people. So when churches try something that's a creative, inclusive, contextually kind of rooted evangelism project in the community, and they, just by virtue of doing it, even if it doesn't go like perfectly as they imagine it might go, just the experience of being outside or being in different territory increases their capacity and joy and desire to do it. So it's a great game to play. We're gonna break into some small groups here for a little bit more deeper discussion that's possible with 60 people. So you're gonna be broken into small groups for about 10 minutes. And I'm gonna set you up for the small group with a couple questions. One of the things, I do this, Lorraine's citing some stuff around introversion. Yeah, absolutely. Introverts, I'm gonna read the full comment before I say that. Right, introverts feel evangelism's too risky. I think introverts are actually, you've heard me say this before, are the best evangelists. I think introverts are better evangelists than extroverts, because introverts tend to do a better job of listening to people than extroverts do. I say this as an extrovert. So introverts don't, your introversion is a gift from God. And extroverts, you're loved too. I see you, Mark. So I do less of this now because I'm serving connectionally, but when I was in district in Birmingham, I would spend a lot of time going to circuits in churches that were really ready to take some steps in evangelism, but they didn't know what they wanted to do something, but they didn't know what to do. And so I would go in and ask them, okay, you're committed to evangelism. Yeah. This might begin a retreat day or a half day, not a church council meeting. I hope you get the sense that this stuff is long-term kind of work. It's not just a quick fix kind of work. But, and I'd ask them, okay, so you're ready to commit to evangelism. What do you think you should be doing? And Methodists or creative working that they thought they should be doing: knocking doors, hanging out at the train station, passing out invitations, having a creative youth club, all these great ideas, right? And 99% of them were things that I would say, that's a great idea, fabulous, great idea, wonderful, wonderful. And by the end of 10 minutes, we'd have this long list of stuff. And then I'd say, so y'all don't suffer from a paucity of ideas, really, really great ideas. Here's the question: why, with no shame, why aren't you doing those things that you've just ideated? Why aren't you doing those things? And of course, one of the common things is time, and what we're doing that we focus on that we don't have time. So that's obvious. Something deeper started to emerge, and I think is real, which goes back to what evangelism is. And I'm going to pop this slide up real quick. Evangelism. This is for the people who are biblical languages people. The word evangelism comes from this Greek word euangelion. We get the English word evangelism from it. You can sort of see there how we do. Anyone know what euangelion means? I'm going to shout it out.
Good news.
Good news, that's what it means. So if we are evangelizing, we are good newsing. EU means good, angelion means news, right? Message. The hint is in the word angel in the middle. There's the messenger of good news. Someone I know said that the only reason they felt like they can take a step into evangelism because the word angel was there. There was a young person that talked about a young sort of teenager said the fact that the lion was there in there as well was a sign of courage. He could commit to evangelism. But euangelion. So the heart of this stuff is good news, right? That's what evangelism is carrying the good news, living the good news, listening for the good news, speaking the good news, being the good news. Here's the thing that's deeper than what are the things we should be doing. I think sometimes we think about evangelism as a sort of a set of techniques, a set of skills, a set of practices, and I think evangelism certainly involves that. But deeper than those things that we might do in the community or creative ways to invite people to church or etc., is the heart of the matter, which is what is the good news? What is the gospel? And I think long-term culture shift for us as Methodists is about how individually and as local congregations, we have a way of talking about what the gospel is that is rooted, owned is the wrong word, but that is claimed. And I don't mean that we all have to have the same answer in our local church, but a local church has an ease or a kind of resonant way of talking about when we say good news, when we say gospel, we generally mean this. This is a theological work, and it's longer term work, but I think it's actually where the fun is and the joy is discovering what is the good news for us. And we are probably all over the theological map, and I think that's a good thing. I'm someone who believes that there are lots of really faithful answers to the question, what is the good news? I definitely think there's some boundaries, just speaking for myself. I mean, I think anything that's destructive or separating others from others or separating others from God is probably not good news, but I think there's lots of faithful, creative answers in between those boundaries. So I'm going to invite you to break into some small groups now, and here are the questions. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes. About 2 minutes to reflect, and then in your groups about 1 minute to share, and however you want to. But I put 3 questions there. You might pick one and reflect on it and share. So the first, what is the gospel? What is the good news? What is it? If you were preaching about it to the congregation, or if someone asked you on the bus for some reason, they saw you reading your Bible, and gosh, it's so weird, all my examples. Would you be sitting next to someone on the bus these days? If someone in a socially distanced way saw you walking down the street, holding a Bible or walking to the church and said, so what's the good news? What would you say? A different way of getting at that might be, what does the good news mean for you personally? That's sort of a testimony question. My life is made different by the good news in this way. And the last question is sort of a discipleship question. How, if someone is receiving that good news or more thoroughly, increasingly resonating with the good news over the course of their life, what does that person increasingly look like? Or what does that church increasingly look like? Or what does that community or world increasingly look like? So I think someone's going to break us into small groups now. I'll put that question in the chat too, so we can see it. But do take a few minutes to reflect before you start to chat. So I know the extroverts are raring to go when you get into the group, but give yourself a minute or two just to think. And then I think we'll come back here at, let's say, 3:07. Let's say 3:10. 3:10. Is that cool? Does someone know who's breaking us out into groups?
Yep, all sorted.
Great.
We're going now.
See you in 13 minutes.
Welcome
Welcome back.
that way.
I hope you had some good conversation. Wonderful. If we had a load more time, we'd sort of unpack that. The question I was talking earlier about, like in church, often we don't ask people the deep questions of like, how are you? Who are you? What are you for? Why are you? We don't ask those questions of each other or people in our communities. And we often, even though we are people committed to God, we often don't ask the question of what is the good news? What is the gospel? How are we being called to kind of host this gospel? How are we called to be shaped by it? How are we called to communicate it? Until we have some shared sense of what we are actually talking about, it becomes difficult. Again, not that we're all trying to get to the right answer, but when I'm working with a congregation or a circuit to think about an evangelism practice, at the beginning you can give people a list of things they can just try and get out there and try stuff, which is great. But when a congregation or a circuit commits to the deep dive kind of work over time and does the work, again, over a series of retreats, over a series of months, of seasons, and then begin to get kind of, clear is not the right word, but begin to sort of have a shared kind of response to that question, then the evangelistic practice gets more creative and more rooted, because it's not just a list of things we have to do. It comes out of knowing and claiming more deeply, this is the way that God is speaking to us right now. This is how God is saving us or transforming us, and this is what we have to share. We only have about 20 minutes left, and so what I'd like to do just really quickly is spin you through some of the things that are available that we are bringing online now, both in figuratively and literally online, kind of following the conference's decision to embrace the connectional strategy for evangelism and growth. So we've got some things already working that have been piloted that we're rolling out now, and lots of things will come into being over the next few years. But just want to share my screen again, and I'll take you through some of the things available, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end on anything that you want to talk about. Great. So these are some, again, all of this stuff is listed in that sheet I sent. It's all available online. But the Methodist way of life is essentially a way of, if you think about our calling as a denominational policy of mission, this is what we're for, this is what we're about as a whole church. A Methodist way of life sort of asks us to think about what does it mean for us individually and communally to respond to the gospel of God's love in Jesus Christ in our whole lives, in every orb of our lives, not just in our religious life, but in 24/7. And so a Methodist way of life is essentially sort of an accountable discipleship system that's been developed coming out of the Yorkshire West District and the work of Roger Walton, a former president of conference, former chair of that district, and now has been sort of worked on over the past 2 years, and it's being delivered. You can go to that website there and see all kinds of resources. Very, very accessible, kind of sort of rule of life or pattern of life that harkens back in some ways to our ancient practices as Methodists about asking, interrogating each other, discerning with each other, what is our life about, where we're being challenged by God, but doing that in a very contemporary way. So that's a discipleship system. Remember, everything good flows from God. So if we're not centered in God, if we're not centered in a kind of a thorough practice of discipleship ourselves as disciples who are continuing to be formed, then our practice in mission and evangelism and worship gets thin, doesn't it? So that's a discipleship practice. You'll hear more about that. There'll be actually mailed print resources coming out in the season to come. For churches that are really interested in some mission planning, I know sometimes you think about a mission planning, you think, oh God, another drudgery kind of experience of trying to put pen to paper and write out some kind of form. We don't really mean that. We really mean sort of helping congregations listen for what God's calling them to do, listening to the needs and hopes and gifts of their communities, the localities they find themselves in, and then in a reflective process, making some decisions. Initially, what one or two things are we going to do differently for the next year or so, and then trying some things. So the mission planning guidance you'll find online is really kind of self-led is the wrong way to say it. It can be led by a local leader, either an ordained or a layperson or a body of leaders who are helping a congregation kind of move through an 8-step process. It's all there online, really accessible, has been developed in concert with the Learning Network and district missioners, and I've been a couple of district chairs. So really, really good stuff, I think. For congregations that are ready, or circuits that are ready to go really kind of into an intensive, intensive experience of trying to get unstuck, to get freed for this new world that we find ourselves in, this transformational leadership learning community is a wonderful thing. We piloted it last year with 10 teams. And so it's a team-based model. We were doing it last year in physical retreat. So you gather a number of times over the year. It's all paid for by Connexional funding for churches that commit. But it's a process of work at those retreats with other teams from around the connection who are paying attention to their kind of mission, but also lots of kind of attentive work in between the conferences. And there's also, it's facilitated by experienced practitioners, and also there's coaching built into it. So we're recruiting right now for teams for starting in early 2021. If your church or circuit is interested, there's space, so you can find out more online. Again, it can't just be one person, it's a team of people that needs to come from the locality. Really, really good results from the pilot. Loads of stuff, as we all have seen over the past 6 months, webinars and Zoom workshops on all kinds of different facets of evangelism. You can go online and see, it's great stuff to not just coming up. There's a church planting course, for example, coming up if you want to think about how do you plant church or pioneer something new or start a fresh expression online. There's a 6-session course, totally free, starting in October. Lots of cool stuff coming. There's also a wonderful catalog of stuff that's happened this summer on everything from mission planning to evangelism to anti-racism and evangelism, all kinds of stuff, which is there for you to share, and it can be a wonderful way to do some training in your locality. There's also stuff online if you're ready for like quick next steps, quick ideas just to get started. I hope you'll see kind of what I've shared today is really thinking about the long term, the deep dive, the culture shifting kind of stuff, which happens only if we really show up to it and commit to it. But 2 things which I invite you to think about, which you can do right now, 2 kind of quick things or simple things which you might commit to, and then we'll move into a Q&A time. The first is after a conference this year, we reached out just to put out an open call for people to share their testimonies. So if you think about, we talked about at the beginning of the session today, talking about our stories, the need to share our stories and to listen for the stories of other people. So there's our human story, and then there's God's story, which you could, I guess, think about as the gospel. But testimony is a way of both of those. So testimony is not just my story. That's my story is my story. Testimony is not just God's story. God's story is God's story. But a testimony is my story in light of God's story. My story in light of the grace of God. My story as I continue to undergo God. So we put out an invitation for people to share it's sort of a light testimony, kind of short micro testimony of this is what the good news sounds like, feels like, looks like to me. And we've compiled probably 100 testimonies into a short kind of 8-minute video. it's a wonderful thing to watch, just to see the diversity of the Methodist people talking about the good news. But it's just to watch it is lovely. But it's a wonderful conversation starter. So if you feel like, I think testimony is one of the things. I know it was the year of testimony last year, and so what's the story was our presidential theme last year. I just think it's one of those gospel gold kind of things. It's a practice that takes us deeper into the heart of God, deeper into prayer, deeper into our own journey, but also takes us deeper into other people's stories and into our common story as the church and the world. It's just an easy thing to do. And so it's a wonderful way, if you watch that, and then you can maybe in a small group or in your worship service, invite people to share. I'm gonna say it's a quick fix, but it's an easy thing to start with. And then this year of prayer that has been called for by conference as we seek to be a more evangelistic, growing, inclusive, and justice-seeking church. We know that we will only do that by God's grace. We will only do that, even though we'll succeed and fail, we'll only be able to kind of be transformed if we offer ourselves to God, if we keep coming back to God and learn to trust and give ourselves away for the good news. And that happens in lots of places, but it happens, I think, where we learn to do that is in prayer. And we pray in different ways. And so every part of the year of prayer on Tuesdays at 12:45, every Tuesday in this connectional year, we're gathering 15 minutes of prayer. And it's led by different people of different theological backgrounds, different traditions. But the kind of resonance through it all is that we're trying just to open ourselves to God together as a larger church. So that's a nice thing you can do on a weekly basis. So I've loved being with y'all today virtually. It's different. I would love to be with you physically one day, and when things are safe. Mark and I are planning a trip for me to come up and spend time all over Scotland this week. I should have been there, but I hope when things are safe, I'll be able to do that and come figure out the geography of Scotland a little better, but also meet some of y'all and the fabulous communities you serve and minister and mission in. I want to close by just inviting your questions or feedback or anything you want to say. I believe, in this stuff passionately, but I am one among equals here. We are all in it together. So if you have questions, feedback, anything you want to say, counter narratives, that's all welcome. We're in it together. You can either do this, or it might be easier if you use your reactions button and if you want to speak, stick your thumbs up or hands up, and that way we'll be able to see you and I can call on you. We have about 10 minutes.
Great question to start with in chat, Trey.
Great. Oh, fab. How can we help the seeds sown through lockdown online worship to bear fruit? That's a great question. I think, two things come to mind. I think if we develop a more of an ease of seeing worship as a place where stories are shared, both stories about God, but our own stories, and where that becomes, let's say testimony as a way of talking about that. If that becomes just one of the things that we do in worship, I think we had started that way before COVID, but I think actually online worship it makes it easier for people to share their testimonies, and for groups to share testimonies. So that's if we could build that practice into our way of being in lockdown, that is an essential practice of evangelism. I think also, and I'm not speaking for the ministry section of the Methodist Church or from the conference office, but I think there will be an invitation to all of us as pandemic shifts, and we pray for the time where we move into a time where we can gather physically as well in a safe way. But I think we might use this time, Jill, to think about, are we being called to think about a hybrid ministry in our context? So a chance to be together kind of incarnationally, physically, but also will online continue to be part of our ministry and mission, so that when COVID, when we're in a different place, that we don't just say, okay, good, we can now go back to meeting physically and wrap up all that Zoom stuff. I think the capacity to be in conversation with people that would never come through across our physical thresholds is very high right now. Other questions? Bob. Oh, Lord, I hope so. Bob's question, if worship reaches people we might not be able to identify and name, can we still accept that we are sharing the good news? I mean, I think so. I think our job, I keep coming back to the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Our job is, by God's grace, our job, but it's just to offer the fragments, the things that we have, the good news that we have, and trust God to use it and recycle it and take it, and we just never know. So absolutely, Bob, I wouldn't want that to, I would want that to kind of count. I do think that there are ways that we can think about not just broadcast, but how do we think about developing relationships with people online? So I think if there's a danger, one of the dangers of our online kind of ministry is that we think if we just do a really good job of broadcasting or doing a really polished thing, then that will be enough. And that's a great thing in and of itself, but I'm really interested in discipleship. So how do we build relationships with people, and then from relationships into discipleship? And so that happens only if you're thinking about whatever your version of the Methodist way of life is, which I think is actually, interestingly, maybe in the same way I was talking about worship, small groups or discipleship groups or whatever you call them might be easier, or is easier in some ways online than it was in lockdown. I'll give you an example from a different organization. Some of you know that I'm part of Alcoholics Anonymous, been a member of AA for years and years. And when we locked down, of course, AA couldn't meet in churches or anywhere either. And so I was like, this is going to be really interesting to see what happens. Will people drink more because of lockdown, all kind of stuff. We have seen an explosion of attendance in AA meetings because people who were too nervous or too whatever to walk across the threshold have found their way, because AA has done an amazing job of being clear about how you can find support. And so the online support groups, sort of like discipleship groups, have been just amazing. So from broadcast to kind of relationship building. Other questions?
Trey, I'll just fill in the space while people are thinking of their questions. I know that here in the Scotland district, we've committed to something called Tranche 2 as part of God for All. I wonder if you could just outline for us what being in Tranche 2 as a district might mean.
Right. So I mentioned new places for new people. So this commitment to start a whole bunch of new Christian communities over the next several seasons in the Methodist Church. And we're trying to do that in a way that is somewhere between, like, here's the model. We don't want to do it on the one end, but here's a model that everyone has to follow. So do this and things will be fine if you just do this over and over again. That's not really gospel. But we also don't want to just sort of say, start new places, go. Good luck, we bless you. So we're trying to find a way of working really closely with districts in a kind of coming alongside in a sort of consulting kind of way as the Evangelism and Growth team, to help districts think about how can districts build into their mission policy new places for new people, Church of the Margins, as just something the district does. starting every district and every circuit eventually would be starting new Christian communities. And so, again, we don't want to just sort of say that and hope it will happen. We wanted to organize that. And so what we've done is we've asked the districts to sort of self-select into 3 tranches. And interestingly, the districts did that and sort of came out quite evenly based on their own prayer and reflection. And so tranche 1 is for next connectional year. Tranche 2 is for 2022, 2023, and tranche 3 is for 23, 24, 24. And so the districts in those tranches, we hope, and we're not sure of this because obviously all the funding, central funding available to launch something new. And to do that in a way that was really, really joined up, really coordinated. So not just a really cool new church or a really cool new set of churches or new Church of the Margins projects, but to do that in such a way that these new places for new people are seen as both kind of model, but also kind of engine or supply for the new churches that will be coming after. So Scotland is in tranche 2, which means that next year you will start working with the ENG team on thinking over 12 months, what kind of new place for new people do we want to start in Scotland? Where might that be? What places might that be? How would this hold together? And we want to, over the consultation process, come up with something so much more creative than you should do it this way, or like, see what happens, you know? So something that's really joined up and creative. So yeah. But again, I think the thing I want to sort of undergird there is, if we only started 30 new churches, I mean, that would be an offering to God. If every district started something new, that'd be a beautiful thing and an offering to God. But we're much more interested in, and what we need against that culture shift is 30 districts saying, we're going to start this church as a sign of our commitment as a district to be a district that starts new churches and circuits that start new churches as part of our ministry. And that's where the strategy moves us into. It's not just 30 cool new things, but, you know, sort of the ripples out of starting new things as a way of being. I know we're at 3:30, and I know y'all, I've only been on Zoom for an hour and a half. Y'all been on Zoom since this morning. So can I just say, unless there's a burning desire or burning question, I'm not seeing anyone. I just want to say thank you for welcoming in an interloper into your conferencing today. It's lovely to see your faces. You have the links. I want to put up one last slide here. If you're interested in seasonal updates, we're going to send out sort of an email, an e-news, once every 6 to 8 weeks that lets people know how the movement is going. So again, really thinking about how do we help everyone take a step into evangelism in a way that's kind of authentic to them and to their context. And so if you'd be interested in updates, just send an email to that email address and we will add you to the list. If you have any questions from today or need any help, you can also, that email eventually wends its way to my inbox, so you can reach me there too if you have any questions. Thank you. Lovely to be with y'all.
Trey, I just noticed that Joyce did pop a question into the chat just as you were winding up. I wouldn't want you to miss that question.
Thank you, Joyce. I would say that I could see you. I see you as part of all of it. Again, I think that hybrid, and make sure I'm understanding your question when you say, where do you fit in? As an evangelist, is that what you mean?
I don't have a church to go to. We have some services here, but they're ecumenical. though there are quite a lot of people with a Brethren background and few with a Methodist background. I'm a retired minister. But I now realise that my whole life took a turn right at the beginning of COVID. But I don't know where I would fit in, do what.
Mm-hmm. That's a if I were in your area, I would want to follow up and have a conversation about that, because I could think of a lot of places where, you know, folks who were homebound or in places where accessibility was challenging, of ways not only to participate in community like we are today, and I think online church is a way to do that, but also to be an evangelist. So it's not just as a recipient of community, but as a participant, as a leader. And what is your experience and others of the good news, and how are you kind of understanding God differently, kind of in the particularity of your experience? Yeah, that's the questions that I would want to get at and be dialogue about.
I just don't know where I would fit in this community with a good number of the people in my part of the village having a very different outlook from me, theologically, church-wise, etc. I gather there are quite a lot of people who are unchurched in the village, but they live up the hill and I live here.
I'm just going to jump in because thank you, Joyce and Trey, for your conversation. I'm trying to kind of now pull us back onto time. We're 5 minutes over. That's all right. I wonder if part of the Scotland answer, Joyce, is to maybe, I might be so bold, I might ask Nick Wooler to get in touch with you. You know, the missing Methodist thing and the isolated Methodist thing and how we fit in. And I just wonder if there's a conversation there that might be helpful or supportive.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Trey, we thank you for your time and for your energy for us this Saturday afternoon. I wonder if the last thing I might ask you to do is to pray for us as the synod closes. Would you happily do that for us?
I would do. Could I invite us to pray this prayer together, which is a prayer that we are praying on Tuesdays. I think I'm going to pop that up. Oh. Can you see that prayer, the breakthrough prayer? Why don't we unmute? It'll be a glorious cacophony of voices, but it's a short prayer. And so this is a prayer we're praying every Tuesday, asking God to break through into our reality. So let's pray. Let's pray together. God of love,
More beautiful than can possibly imagine.
Bless with your Holy Spirit. Help us let go of our lives and our churches and use means of peace.
Because that's the good news of Jesus. Jesus
Force the way.
Show us the way. Amen.
Sounded like Pentecost to me.